Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Frank Discourse. This is episode number 4. We're going to do something a little different today. We're actually going to commentate on a very important and, in my opinion, great speech by RFK Jr. And it's a speech that he made, was it yesterday or 2 days ago?
2 days ago.
Oh, 2 days
Friday.
ago.
Today's Sunday now.
Yeah, okay. 2 days ago when he decided to drop out and endorse Donald Trump. I think it's an outstanding speech. I think that everybody and every American should listen to the speech. So we're going to go through it, and I'll be pausing and commentating on some certain things. So here we go.
I'm sorry to keep everybody waiting. 16 months ago, in April of 2023, I launched my campaign for President of the United States. I began this journey as a Democrat, the party of my father, my uncle, the party which I pledged my own allegiance to long before I was old enough to vote. I attended my first Democratic convention at the age of 6 in 1960. And back then, the Democrats were the champions of the Constitution, of civil rights. The Democrats stood against authoritarianism, against censorship, against colonialism, imperialism, and unjust wars. We were the party of labor, of the working class. The Democrats were the party of government transparency and the champion of the environment.
I think he overstates, and maybe it's a nostalgic romanticism of just the Democrats being all those things. I mean, there were definitely some of those things, especially when it comes to labor, but anti-colonial, was anybody even talking about anti-colonialism back then? I mean, maybe some fringe.
They were. John Kennedy talks about it in his inaugural speech. He talks a lot about colonialism around the world and bringing up the developing countries. Mostly in a Cold War kind of situation, they wanted to support these recently freed countries, and they couched that as anti-colonialism. So they'd said, okay, these countries in East Asia, Africa are now independent. We should support them before the communists come in, which is Vietnam War. I mean, that's the early days of the Vietnam War was. Yeah,
but today, don't they consider that support colonialism? I mean, I think what they're teaching now in colleges are almost any interference whatsoever by any Western civilization and any nation in the Western civilization as colonialism, and that we shouldn't have any hand outside of maybe financial support in these countries.
Yes. I guess they're...
It's an open question. I'm not really sure the answer to that.
Right. I mean, nowadays, right, they would say that, yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's continue.
Our party was the bulwark against big money interests and corporate power. True to its name, it was the party of democracy. As you know, I left that party in October because it had departed so dramatically from the core values that I grew up with. It had become the party of war, censorship, corruption, big pharma, big tech, big ag, and big money. When it abandoned democracy by canceling the primary to conceal the cognitive decline of the sitting president, I left the party to run as an independent.
I think he just knocks it out of the park there with accuracy and description of what the Democratic Party has become. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that so many liberals today have. It's too many people have no idea how it, and it's strange. It's almost as if the parties have kind of switched with nobody switching parties. Although there have been a lot of liberals, the classic liberals, have left the Democratic Party, who now consider themselves independent. Some have gone to the Republican Party, but not many of them. Most of them have become independent, but they have dropped the Democratic Party. And I think a lot of these people are late to the game, and I think their realization of what's happened to the Democratic Party is a little late. I saw this stuff happen in the Democratic Party 20 years ago, and it goes along with what Reagan said decades ago in the 80s, or maybe it was the 70s, when he was asked, why'd you leave the Democratic Party? And he said, I never left the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me.
Sure, yeah.
And I think that's exactly, to his point, what's happening. But unfortunately, not enough Democrats, either they refuse to accept how corrupt the Democratic Party has become, and nobody ever wants to confront. This is the one common thread that I've seen, and through many of my liberal friends, it's they always feel this need to immediately say, well, the Republican Party has become very dangerous. Like they always have to equate the two, that they've equally become horrible. And listen, Republicans are far from perfect, and believe me, I've never seen a party shoot themselves in the foot more than the Republicans.
Oh yeah.
Except for recently, Democrats are really giving them a run of their money and doing that. As one of my favorite expressions is, pardon my language, but and Democrats, the Republicans get fucked up a free cup of coffee, and they've done it over and over again. But I don't see any of this extremism that people like to talk about, because I think it makes them feel better emotionally about their own stances and their own alignment with the Democratic Party when they see their party going to this leftist extremism, which it has. It's become a leftist party. It's no longer a liberal party. And in order to make themselves feel better, in order to accept it, they have to still equate the degradation of their party that the other party, the Republicans, are doing the same thing at the same level. And in my opinion, I don't see any evidence that there's any equivalency to that.
Right. I think it stems from, like RFK says, the Democrats are the party of the working class, and people who identify themselves as working class nowadays, they say, well, I'm a Democrat. My father was a Democrat. My grandfather was a Democrat. They see the Democratic Party as a big tent party, which it at least it may have been in the 60s and the 70s, or at least they portrayed themselves that way. But now I feel that the Republican Party has become that big tent party, and these people can't admit that. I mean, evidenced by what Kennedy's going to say in the speech.
Yeah,
he's going to say, "Look, I'm a Democrat. I have to move over now to vote for Republican because, something that we've noticed all these years. He's saying it now, finally."
Yeah, I think a lot of these liberals, they're clinging on to the romanticism of the legacy of the Democratic Party, and they can't quite let it go. But there's something emotionally about it that they're still so attached to.
Yeah.
And so they can't bring themselves to say, you know what, the Republicans are a far better, far from perfect, but a far better choice right now than the Democrats. And I guess when you have the binary of only Democrats or Republicans, it's not like any third party has a snowball's chance in hell of winning any election in this country, except for maybe in a more local election. But they don't have that option. And so it really truly is an either or. I guess the only third option is to not vote.
Sure, which a lot of people are doing.
Yeah.
Well, they always have, I guess. It's hard. Yeah. The thing is that the older generations, I think, either boomers or the Generation X, is looking at the Democratic Party as the party of the Kennedys. or it's John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, and that's why this speech is so jarring to them, and they're trying to. It's like a cognitive dissonance. They can't understand how one of their own is saying these things. Like they haven't, come to the other side yet. As opposed to younger generations, which don't really identify themselves as Democrat or Republican in the same way the older generations did. They might see themselves as liberals or conservatives or leftists, but not party designations.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that, and I think it shows, to your point, of how left the Democratic Party has become with how they have maligned this man so much ever since he started, threw his hat in his ring, even as a Democrat, and wanted to challenge Joe Biden for the nomination. And when the Democratic Party mechanisms went into action and would not allow that under any circumstance, what did they do? He was forced to go and run as an independent. So, I mean, that right there shows you the indication, because as far as I can tell, I don't see really much, if any, of RFK Jr.'s ideas and philosophies and his political outlook has changed at all. And again, it's another proof of how the Democratic Party's ideals and views have changed and have gone so far leftward. It's another proof of why and how they've maligned this man so much in the last year or so.
Sure.
So, all right, let's continue.
Okay.
The mainstream of American politics and journalism derided my decision. Conventional wisdom said that it would be impossible even to get on the ballot as an independent because each state poses an insurmountable tangle of arbitrary rules for collecting signatures. I would need over 1 million signatures, something no presidential candidate in history had ever achieved. And then I'd need a team of attorneys and millions of dollars to handle all the legal challenges from the DNC. The naysayers told us that we were climbing a glass version of Mount Impossible. So the first thing I want to tell you is that we proved them wrong. We did it because beneath the radar of mainstream media organs, we inspired a massive independent political movement. More than 100,000 volunteers sprang into action, hopeful that they could reverse our nation's decline. Many worked 10-hour days, sometimes in blizzards and blazing heat. They sacrificed family time, personal commitments, and sleep month after month, energized by a shared vision of a nation healed of its divisions. They set up tables at churches and farmers' markets. They canvassed door to door. In Utah and in New Hampshire, volunteers collected signatures in snowstorms, convincing each supporter to stop in the frigid cold, to take off their gloves, and to sign legibly. During a heat wave in Nevada, I met a tall, athletic volunteer who cheerfully told me that he had lost 25 pounds collecting signatures in 117-degree heat. To finance this effort, young Americans donated their lunch money, and senior citizens gave up part of their Social Security checks. Our 50-state organization collected.
I just want to add, like, the comparison between what he's saying about his grassroots effort in comparison to the Harris campaign, where they just installed somebody. It's such a different dichotomy there, to showing, like, here's the real kind of Democratic Party. These people are grassroots people. They're going out, working for a candidate.
Yeah.
Not against the other party's candidate, but actually for a candidate. They actually support somebody, and they're willing to do all these things, whether it be in 117-degree weather or freezing temperatures, to show their support for. It harkens back to the days of his uncle and his father, where people would, go door to door and try to get you to vote for somebody.
Yeah,
You know,
that's
it's nostalgic.
That's a great point, James. That's a really good point. And yeah, it really does show that how he's still so based in the structure of democracy and voting and how to become a candidate.
Nobody's going door to door for Kamala Harris.
Yes.
You know, in
Well, they just inserted her.
Right. Right.
And there's not a single delegate that ever voted her to become the nomination. The Democratic Party just did it. It just happened, magically almost. It's something that I think is absolutely vital to keep state to state, but these processes in each state have become so what's the word I'm looking for?
Arduous?
Yes, so arduous is to get any kind of viable third candidate, and I think that is very anti-democratic.
Sure.
I have no problem with a third or fourth or fifth candidate, and that scares the living hell out of the Democrats and Republicans alike.
Oh, because they built the entire system to be a two-party system.
Yes.
I mean, it's not what the founders wanted. I mean,
Exactly.
they didn't want parties at all.
Yeah.
It's a natural outgrowth of humanity to kind of section off, but they tried their best to avoid that.
Yeah, and hence the disillusion to so many people in this country towards our entire political system, because especially the younger generations, they see this as just an absolute joke and absolute corruption, that it's only two candidates who have any possible chance of winning any election.
Right.
Those millions of signatures and more, no presidential campaign in American political history has ever done that. And so I want to thank all of those dedicated volunteers and congratulate the campaign staff who coordinated this enormous logistical feat. Your accomplishments were regarded as impossible. You carried me up that glass mountain. You pulled off a miracle. You achieved what all the pundits said could never be done. You have my deepest gratitude, and I'm never going to forget that, not just for what you did for my campaign, but for the sacrifices you made because you love our country. You showed everyone that democracy is still possible here. It continues to survive in the press and in the idealistic human energies that still thrive beneath the canvas of neglect and of official and institutional corruption. Today, I'm here to tell you that I will not allow your efforts to go to waste. I'm here to tell you that I will leverage your tremendous accomplishments to serve the ideals that we share, the ideals of peace, of prosperity, of freedom, of health, all the ideals that motivated my campaign. I'm here today to describe the path forward that you've opened with your commitment and with your hard labors. Now, in an honest system, I believe that I would have won the election. In a system the kind that my father and my uncles thrived in, a system with open debates, with fair primaries, with regularly scheduled debates, with fair primaries, and with a truly independent media untainted by government propaganda and censorship. In a system of nonpartisan courts and election boards, everything would be different. After all, the polls consistently show.
I just wanted to add the way he's describing the primary situation. I mean, it's really reverting back to this pre-20th century or 19th century way of choosing candidates, where they didn't have open primaries. People didn't vote. They sent delegates there, and they picked the person. They didn't have an open primary system like they have now. I think that's a 20th century invention, and that's what they're doing now. They're going back to the Democrats are going back to just picking somebody at their convention that they want, that no one voted for. So it's this really return back to an antiquated way of doing things. The party that claims to be the party of democracy.
So you're saying in history, back before the 20th century, both parties did kind of what similar to what the Democrats did with Kamala this time?
Off the top of my head, I think that's correct. I don't think they had. I might be completely wrong, but I don't think they had, the primaries we have now, where people went to the ballot and voted. I think that it was more decided
by the powers that be, by the establishment,
right? And smoke-filled rooms and that sort of thing. I did that a lot in the 70s, 1880s. That's how James Garfield got nominated. There was a big infight between the different delegates, and they had 50 ballots or something like that, and nobody could figure out. And then they said, well, that guy gave a really good speech before, the other day. Maybe we'll run him. And he's like, well, I don't want to run. And they're like, no, you're running.
This is Garfield.
Yeah, you're running for president now because you're the best guy. You're like, everybody kind of likes you. Okay.
Wow.
And then he got shot 2 months in. But, so that was unfortunate.
This guy's too effective.
Yeah.
He's too much. Why? I did not know that the primary is more of a modern...
I think so. This is off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But, I think that's the case.
Well, I'll take your word for it. A resident historian, James Fay.
We'll have to
we'll have
check
to
myself.
Yeah, we'll fact check and we'll bring that up in another episode and see what you got right.
Sure.
All right.
Showed me beating each of the other candidates, both in favorability and also in head-to-head matchups. But I'm sorry to say that while democracy may still be alive at the grassroots, it has become little more than a slogan for our political institutions, for our media, and for our government, and most sadly at all for me, for the Democratic Party. In the name of saving democracy, the Democratic Party set itself to dismantling it, lacking confidence in its candidate, that its candidate could win in a fair election at the voting booth. The DNC waged continual legal warfare against both President Trump and myself. Each time that our volunteers turned in those towering boxes of signatures needed to get on the ballot, the DNC dragged us into court, state after state, attempting to erase their work and to subvert the will of the voters who had signed those petitions. It deployed DNC-aligned judges to throw me and other candidates off the ballot and to throw President Trump in jail. It ran a sham primary that was rigged to prevent any serious challenge to President Biden. Then, when a predictably bungled debate performance precipitated the palace coup against President Biden, the same shadowy DNC operatives appointed his successor, also without an election. They installed a candidate who was so unpopular with voters that she dropped out in 2020 without winning a single delegate. My uncle and my father both relished debate.
Yeah, I want to comment on that. That the Democratic Party, again, I don't care if you're the most staunch Kamala Harris supporter right now. If you don't realize that your party, and maybe you still view the Republican Party as much worse, you still have to acknowledge, and you should be at least, at minimum, concerned of what the Democratic Party has become. They did so many, and again, Republicans did everything they could to prevent Donald Trump from running in 2016. Okay,
sure,
they absolutely, to be fair here and to be objective, the Republicans did everything they could to prevent them. They did not want him. However, if there's not a more democratic process, example, I should say, of a democratic process, it is Trump becoming the Republican nominee for 2016 election.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That, as much as the party itself didn't want him and tried to prevent him from becoming the nominee, he still became it.
Sure.
That is a great example of democracy. It's still at work. And if you're a Democrat, and if you're so married and dedicated and loyal to the party, the Democratic Party, if you don't see what the Democratic Party did to Bernie Sanders, what they did to almost every other candidate and people like Tulsi Gabbard in 2016, and what they just did now, then you have a willful blindness to what's going on in the Democratic Party at a level I can't even begin to comprehend. And what he is saying is 100% correct. There's no conspiracy here. It's truth. And yeah, actually, it was a conspiracy. It was a conspiracy of the Democratic Party to prevent him and Bernie Sanders at all from even coming close to becoming the candidate. Because I've been saying this. I've been saying this for years. As soon as he threw his hat in the ring to run, I said the Democratic Party is so afraid of this guy, of RFK Jr. And I said, people used to look at me sideways, and I said, they are so much more afraid of him than they are Trump. And people were like, huh? I said, well, listen, if Trump becomes the nominee, what changes on the Democratic playbook? Nothing. He's still orange man bad. He's still a threat to democracy. Yada, yada. All the same tropes that they've been throwing about this guy for the last 8 years, 9 years. But this guy would turn the entire establishment of the Democratic Party on its head, as it should be. He will do everything to weed out those who have corrupted the party so extensively. And those people who are controlling and running the Democratic Party now do not want any part of that. He is 1,000 times bigger threat to the Democratic Party than Trump or any Republican could ever be.
Right. Yeah, if their goal was to win and to beat Trump, they would have supported Kennedy. You know, he had the best chance of winning. But at the same time, they'd be giving up what they now stand for, which is their ability to manipulate things behind the scenes. You know, they'd have such a good candidate that they couldn't control him, which is their biggest fear.
And you'd have so many people, the ground roots of the actual the people of America, supporting this man.
Right.
And it would force so many changes. Let's continue here.
They prided themselves on their capacity to go toe-to-toe with any opponent in the battle over ideas. They would be astonished to learn of a Democratic Party presidential nominee who, like Vice President Harris, has not appeared in a single interview or an unscripted encounter with voters for 35 days. This is profoundly undemocratic. How are people to choose when they don't know whom they are choosing? And how can this look to the rest of the world? My father and my uncle were always conscious of America's image abroad because of our nation's role as the template for democracy, the role model for democratic processes, and the leader of the free world. Instead of showing us her substance and character, the DNC and its media organs engineered a surge of popularity for Vice President Harris based upon, well, nothing. No policies, no interviews, no debates, only smoke and mirrors and balloons in a highly produced Chicago circus. There in Chicago, a string of Democratic speakers mentioned Donald Trump 147 times just on the first day. Oh, who needs a policy when you have Trump to hate? In contrast, at the RNC convention, President Biden was mentioned only twice in 4 days.
That's such an important
I do
point.
interviews every day. Many of you have interviewed me. Anybody who asks gets to interview me. Some days I do as many as 10. President Trump, who actually was nominated.
Do you think he'll accept our invite? He says anybody who asks, he'll do an interview with.
Next week, RFK Jr. on the Frank Discourse podcast.
That's got a good ring to it, James.
Our first guest.
Yeah, our first guest. Yeah, well, we don't like to half-ass anything. All right.
Nominated and won an election, also does interviews daily. How did the Democratic Party choose a candidate that has never done an interview or debate during the entire election cycle? We know the answers. They did it by weaponizing the government agencies. They did it by abandoning democracy. They did it by suing the opposition and by disenfranchising American voters. What most alarms me isn't how the...
He's talking about using the law, and there's a term, it's a newer term, and I don't know how long the term has been around, but I'm hearing it more and more because it is true. It's lawfare. Instead of warfare, lawfare.
Yeah, I've been hearing that the past year.
Yeah, exactly, because there's such a reality of it. It's not just a talking point, it's the reality of it. And there's so many things out there that, and these big conglomerates, these big organizations who have millions and millions of dollars and armies of lawyers, they can just wage lawfare on somebody who they know does not have the money, does not have the support, does not have the legal armament to battle it. And so they just fold, and then they win. They win via lawfare, and there's nothing just about it. There's nothing real. And this is why, this is one of the things that does worry me about Trump. I heard the Theo Von interview with Trump, and Theo... it was hysterical. Everybody should listen to that. That's a great. I love Theo Von. The guy is hysterical. Anyway, Theo Von was asking about how to prevent so many of these companies just running roughshod over everybody because of their and preventing lawfare from happening. And Trump's answer to it was simple. He says, "Well, we have to stop the one way to stop it is that the loser has to pay. The loser has to pay all the legal fees of the winner. So you and I are suing each other, James. If you lose, you've got to pay not just your own lawyer fees. You've got to pay my lawyer's fees, and that is a huge financial burden to anybody, and that's going to make people think. So you think, wow, that's a great idea. And in many cases that is. However, you've just basically prevented any little man who's getting stomped by the big man from a lawsuit, from filing a lawsuit, no matter how just and right it may be. Because I mean,
there shouldn't be there is a barrier to entry, but you're making it even more a barrier to entry to suing someone.
Exactly. Some poor soul. Is it what? Who's going to tackle the pharmaceutical companies? Who's going to tackle any big industry, automobile manufacturer? Who's going to? And they may be completely just. Now, again, I don't know how to solve. It's a very complicated, situation, but. My God, if you're preventing the small man from going after a corrupt big man, that's a huge problem, and that's why I kind of recoiled. I think overall, and Trump talked about how they do that in Europe a lot, and okay, it seems to work pretty well over there, but then again, they're not as litigious as we are over here, so maybe that's part of it. But at the same time. There's a big problem. Now, I don't know exactly how to address that problem, but maybe that there's a happy medium. Maybe there's a hybrid of somehow, with certain circumstances, okay, the loser pays for the winner's legal fees, but at the same time, you still have to leave that door open for people who are getting really screwed by the big guys.
That's an interesting point. I haven't seen that part of the Theo Von interview, so I'll have to, check that out.
No, it's good. It's funny. You become your own street lamp.
Yeah, that was good.
Anyway, all right, let's continue.
The Democratic Party conducts its internal affairs or runs its candidates What alarms me is the resort to censorship and media control and the weaponization of the federal agencies. When a U.S. president colludes with or outright coerces media companies to censor political speech, it's an attack on our most sacred right of free expression, and that's the very right upon which all of our other constitutional rights rest. President Biden mocked Vladimir Putin's 88% landslide in the Russian elections, observing that Putin and his party controlled the Russian press, and that Putin prevented serious opponents from appearing on the ballot. But here in America,
irony.
the DNC also prevented opponents from appearing on the ballot. And our television networks expose themselves as Democratic Party organs. Over the course of more than a year, in a campaign where my poll numbers reached at times in the high 20s, the DNC-aligned mainstream media networks maintain a near perfect embargo on interviews with me. During his 10-month presidential campaign in 1992, Ross Perot gave 34 interviews on mainstream networks. In contrast, during the 16 months since I declared, ABC, NBC, CBS, MSNBC, and CNN combined gave only 2 live interviews from me. Those networks instead ran a continuous deluge of hit pieces with inaccurate, often vile, pejoratives and defamatory smears. Some of those same networks and colluded with the DNC to keep me off the debate stage. Representatives of those networks are in this room right now, and I'll just take a moment to ask you to consider the many ways that your institutions have abdicated this really sacred responsibility, the duty of a free press to safeguard democracy and to challenge always the party in power. Instead of maintaining that posture of fierce skepticism toward authority, your institutions have made themselves government mouthpieces and stenographers for the organs of power. You didn't alone cause the devolution of American democracy, but you could have prevented it. The Democrats.
I want to pause there. They absolutely they didn't just. It's not that the mainstream media could have prevented it. They have contributed it to the degradation of journalism and news and not challenging power so much. And this is why you could say, and this is why in Kamala Harris's speech, she blatantly lied when she said that Trump wants to lock up reporters. That's not true.
Sure.
But when Trump does say a comment that the mainstream media is one of the greatest enemies of the American people, he's not entirely wrong. Now, that doesn't mean he wants to lock them up, but he did make in my opinion, I think it's a pretty close to accurate statement. They are the enemy because they have no longer check power. They no longer challenge power unless that power is on the right side of the political fence. They have become, the mainstream news media and most of social media has absolutely, without question, become an auxiliary arm of the Democratic Party. He's 100% right in what he's saying.
Also, maybe not just the Democratic Party, but the establishment, the larger establishment.
Yep.
Our
mainstream institutions, our health institutions, all the foundational structures that this country is based on, is sitting on, the foundational structures of institutions.
Yeah. They're run by the uniparty, as they say.
Yeah. All right, let's continue.
Democratic Party censorship of social media was even more of a naked exercise of executive power. This week, a federal judge, Terry Doty, upheld my injunction against President Biden calling the White House's censorship project, quote, the most egregious violation of the First Amendment in the history of the United States of America. Doty's previous 155-page decision details how just 37 hours after he took the oath of office, swearing to uphold the Constitution, President Biden and his White House opened up a portal and then invited the CIA, the FBI, CISA, which is a censorship agency, it's the center of the censorship industrial complex, DHS, the IRS, and other agencies to censor me and other political dissidents on social media. Even today, users who try to post my campaign videos to Facebook or YouTube get messages that this content violates community standards. 2 days after Judge Doty rendered his decision this week, Facebook was still attaching warning labels to an online petition calling on ABC to include me in the upcoming debate. They said that violates community standards, their community standards. The mainstream media was once the guardian of the First Amendment and democratic principles, and it's joined this systemic attack on democracy. It also, the media justifies their censorship on the grounds of combating misinformation, but governments and oppressors don't censor lies. They don't fear lies. They fear the truth, and that's what they censor. And I don't want any of this to sound like a personal complaint, because it's not. For me, it's all part of a journey, and it's a journey that I signed up with. But I need to make these observations because I think they're critical for us doing the thing that we need to do as citizens in a democracy to assess where we are in this country and what our democracy still looks like, and the assumptions about U.S. leadership around the globe. And are we living up, are we really still a role model for democracy in this country? Or have we made it, a kind of a joke? And here's the good news. While mainstream outlets denied me a critical platform, they didn't shut down my ideas, which have especially flourished among young voters and independent voters, thanks to the alternative media. Many months ago, I promised the American people that I would withdraw from the race if I became a spoiler. A spoiler is someone who will alter the outcome of the election but has no chance of winning. In my heart, I no longer believe that I have a realistic path to electoral victory in the face of this relentless systematic censorship and media control. So I cannot in good conscience ask my staff and volunteers to keep working their long hours or ask my donors to keep giving when I cannot honestly tell them that I have a real path to the White House. Furthermore, our polling consistently showed that by staying on the ballot in the battleground states, I would likely hand the election over to the Democrats with whom I disagree on the most existential issues: censorship, war, and chronic disease.
I want to go over what he's talking about, censorship. I actually had a friend, and I've heard this from other people, saying, I don't know what the right and some of these people are talking about censorship. Here we are, we're able to watch his video, his entire full video. So where's the censorship? And that's somewhat of an intellectually dishonest argument, because, yeah, okay, sure, we are still being able to hear it, and thank God for that. However, if you don't see the mechanisms at work here that on the mainstream, and as he even mentioned, the alternative press or the alternative media, and thank God, and the only thing and the only reason why we have this alternative media is because we have still some corners of freedom and free speech and the First Amendment. But if you don't see a direct attack on that, and like I said, I think it was in the first one. There was a woman who was going to head one of the government agencies that got nixed. It was about the disinformation arm. Yeah.
Right.
And she mentioned that one of the biggest obstacles for of tackling disinformation was the First Amendment.
Right.
That
yeah.
there. If that statement doesn't scare the hell out of you, then I don't know what you're thinking. When we have, I think it's over 45% of the youth in this country, college students. It might even be over 50. And again, I can't remember the numbers. I think I said this on the first podcast, that of college students think that if it comes to hate speech or disinformation, the government should be able to censor it. Right, that is a faith in government that, again, I don't know where this comes from. It has to come from years and years of indoctrination and believing that what do these people think that angels and saints run the government?
Right. I'm just going to say that
they're not just these institutions of power, and their number one aim is to gain more power.
Right. But, like Milton Friedman says in the famous interview on Donahue, he says that Phil Donahue says, well, shouldn't the government be in charge of regulating these things? Shouldn't they be in charge of determining things for our best interest? And Milton Friedman says, who are these angels that we're voting for? Show me where they are.
Yeah.
He's like, that's not how people operate.
Yeah.
They don't operate for the greater good. That's not against their nature.
They operate for their own self-interest.
Right.
But thank God we still have this.
That's for another conversation.
If these people who think, oh, we still have all this free, look, we're being able to watch and listen to this speech. If you don't see the mechanisms that are attacking our ability to do this, they are underway. They are happening right now as we speak.
Right.
Just
because stuff is also, just because it's out there doesn't mean it's being promoted or that the average people are seeing it. The average people aren't sitting here watching a low information voter isn't sitting there watching an hour RFK speech. They may hear on the news that, oh, he dropped out.
Yeah.
He's endorsing Trump, and they say, oh, that's horrible. How could he do that? But they don't know what he's saying. They just hear, oh, he must be just as evil as Trump now because something must have gotten to him. Now he's betraying his family name.
Yeah.
But they don't. The algorithm doesn't promote these type of things.
No.
So that's our biggest thing. One of our biggest things is the algorithms on these social media sites that are hiding things. That's part of the censorship. That's the biggest. It's not necessarily
algorithms built by biased, flawed human beings.
Right.
So, all right, let's continue.
Oh, I want everyone to know that I am not terminating my campaign. I am simply suspending it and not ending it. My name will remain on the ballot in most states. If you live in a blue state, you can vote for me without harming or helping President Trump or Vice President Harris. In red states, the same will apply. I encourage you to vote for me. And if enough of you do vote for me, and neither of the major party candidates win 270 votes, which is quite possible. In fact, today our polling shows them tying at 269 to 269. And I could conceivably still end up in the White House in a contingent election. But
that's a big ask, Bobby.
In about 10 battleground states where my presence would be a spoiler, I'm going to remove my name. And I've already started that process and urge voters not to vote for me. It's with a sense of victory and not defeat that I'm suspending my campaign activities. Not only did we do the impossible by collecting 1 million signatures, we changed the national political conversation forever. Chronic disease, free speech, government corruption, breaking our addiction to war, have moved to the center of politics. I can say to all who have worked so hard the last year and a half, thank you for a job well done. Three great causes drove me to enter this race in the first place, primarily. And these are the principal causes that persuaded me to leave the Democratic Party and run as an independent. And now to throw my support to President Trump. The causes were free speech, the war in Ukraine, and the war on our children. I've already described some of my personal experiences and struggles with the government's censorship industrial complex. I want to say a word about the Ukraine war. The military industrial complex has provided us with a familiar comic book justification, like they do on every war, that this one is a noble effort to stop a supervillain, Vladimir Putin, from invading the Ukraine and then to thwart his Hitler-like march across Europe. In fact, tiny Ukraine is a proxy in a geopolitical struggle initiated by the ambitions of the U.S. neocons for American global hegemony. I'm not excusing Putin for invading Ukraine.
Are they neocons still? Because it's the Democratic Party that's in power right now, and Democrats actually, I think, more than Republicans. I mean, I think it's close. I think when it comes to Democratic citizens to Republican citizens, I think the gap is much bigger. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the Democrats are more for helping out Ukraine than the Republicans are. So I don't know if it's the neocons who want to keep the Ukrainian support going.
I did think that, but I think he's using... I guess he's using the term neocon as we would maybe say uniparty, who want wars and want continued military-industrial complex. You know, it used to be a neocon thing.
Yes, I agree.
In the 80s, 90s, that sort of thing, early 2000s with Iraq. But now that's shifted to more of a not a Republican Democrat thing, but a uniparty, both parties together.
Yeah, kind of like the quote unquote establishment.
Right, right.
Well, this is, I mean, for the record, that this is one of the ways where I part ways with the conservatives. This and it's one of the few one of the things that I separate myself with from the conservatives, and I don't really jive with most of them. You know, that and Olympic boxers, but is I actually am for supporting financially and with military supplies, military weapons. I am for supporting the Ukraine. I mean, they are a sovereign country. They were completely unjustifiably invaded by Putin, by Russia.
Right.
And I think I think we should help them out. And I don't mind a small portion of our GDP going towards towards aiding Ukraine and fighting for their independence. I have no problem with this. I don't believe in this complete isolationist mentality that more and more Republicans and certainly more and more conservatives believe in. I don't. I still think in some ways, and I hate to use this term, but it's the only term I can think of off the top of my head, we still need to be the world's policeman. And if everybody says, why do we have to be the world's policeman? I always answer that with a follow-up question. Then who's going to be? Because somebody is always going to be the world's policeman. And what? Do you want China to be the world policeman? Do you want Russia to be the world policeman? Do you want China, Russia, and Iran combined to be the world's policeman? Do you trust that?
Yeah,
I mean, granted,
sure.
as many problems as we have and as imperfect that we have, I still much rather us and the Western democracies to be the world's policeman than any of those countries. So somebody has to be the world's policeman, and that's just a very uncomfortable fact that I don't think a lot of people want to address or accept. Well, we don't have to be the world's policeman. Somebody is going to be, and that's just the fact of reality. That's the fact of a world. So
Right.
so
Yeah,
I
we
don't
can delve
believe in
into
this
that.
isolationist.
We
Yeah.
can delve into that more in a different episode. But
Okay.
yeah, I understand. I mean, I get both sides, but we should delve
Yes,
into that.
I think both sides have legitimate arguments. But,
Right.
okay. Are you telling me just to shut the hell up and continue, James? I agree. Thank you. This is why James is so pivotal in this and so important on this podcast. Here we go.
Right? He had other options. But the war is Russia's predictable response to the reckless neocon project of extending NATO to encircle Russia, a hostile act. The credulous media rarely explained to Americans that we unilaterally walked away from 2 intermediate nuclear weapons treaties with Russia and then put nuclear-ready Aegis missile systems in Romania and Poland. This is a hostile act. And that the Biden White House repeatedly spurned Russia's offer to settle this war peacefully. The Ukraine war began in 2014 when U.S. agencies overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine and installed a hand-picked pro-Western government that launched a deadly civil war against ethnic Russians in Ukraine. In 2019, America walked away from a peace treaty, the Minsk Agreement, that had been negotiated between Russia and Ukraine by European nations. And then in April of 2022, we wanted the war. In April of 2022, President Biden sent Boris Johnson to Ukraine to force President Zelensky to tear up a peace agreement that he and the Russians had already signed, and the Russians were withdrawing troops Kiev and Donbass and Lugansk. And that peace agreement would have brought peace to the region and would have allowed Donbass and Lugansk to remain part of Ukraine. President Biden stated that month that his objective in the war was regime change in Russia. His Defense Secretary, Lloyd Austin, simultaneously explained that America's purpose in the war was to exhaust the Russian army, to degrade its capacity to fight anywhere else in the world. These objectives, of course, have nothing to do with what they were telling Americans about protecting Ukraine's sovereignty. Ukraine is a victim in this war, and it's a victim of the West. Since then, of Russia and both Russia and the West. Since then, we have, since tearing up that agreement, forcing Zelensky to tear up the agreement, we've squandered the flower of Ukrainian youth, as many as 600,000 Ukrainian kids and over 100,000 Russian kids, all of whom we should be mourning, have died, and the Ukraine's infrastructure is destroyed. The war has been a disaster for our country as well. We squandered nearly $200 billion already, and these are badly needed dollars in our communities, suffering communities all over our country. The Nord Stream pipeline sabotage and the sanctions have destroyed Europe's industrial base, which formed the bulwark of U.S. national security. A strong Germany with a strong industry is a much, much stronger deterrent to Russia, and a Germany that is deindustrialized and turned into just an extension of U.S. military base. We've pushed Russia into a disastrous alliance with China and Iran. We're closer to the brink of nuclear exchange than at any time since 1962. And the neocons in the White House don't seem to care at all. Our moral authority and our economy are in shambles. And the war gave rise to the emergence of BRICS, which now threatens to replace the dollar as the global reserve currency. This is a first-class calamity for our country. Judging by her bellicose, belligerent speech last night in Chicago, we can assume that President Harris will be an enthusiastic advocate for this and other neocon military adventures. And President Trump says that he will reopen negotiations with President Putin and end the war overnight as soon as he becomes president. This alone would justify my support for his campaign. Last summer, it looked like no candidate was willing to negotiate a quick end to the Ukraine war, to tackle chronic disease epidemic, to protect free speech, our constitutional freedoms, to clean corporate influence out of our government, or to defy the neocons and their agenda of endless military adventurism. But now one of the two candidates has adopted these issues as his own, to the point where he has asked to enlist me in his administration. I'm speaking, of course, of Donald Trump. Less than 2 hours after President Trump narrowly escaped assassination.
You know, it's one thing that he's giving up or stopping his campaign. It's another thing that he's endorsing Donald Trump.
Right.
But it's a whole other thing that Donald Trump has invited him to be part of his cabinet and be part of his administration. So
Sure. It really shows a cooperation between, the new MAGA Republicans, that kind of thinking, and the old school Democrats. It's causing this big tent.
Yeah, I mean,
party.
imagine how powerful the Democrats would be if they, instead of Trump, embraced JFK Jr. I mean, it would be huge for the Democrats. It would also give them so much more validity, and it would just give them so much more authenticity.
Yeah, they'd be unstoppable.
Yeah, exactly. And, I have to say that, we all know Trump's got an ego the size of this country. And him warming up to his former opponents isn't one of the hallmarks of his MO.
Right.
And the fact that he's doing this, I don't know. I'm happy about it. I'm very happy to see Trump doing these things and embracing somebody like RFK Jr. But it still is. It's pleasantly surprising to me.
Sure.
Oh, all right, let's continue.
Callie Means called me on my cell phone. I was then in Las Vegas. Callie is arguably the leading advocate for food safety, for soil regeneration, and for ending the chronic disease epidemic that is destroying America's health and ruining our economy. Callie has exposed the insidious corruption at the FDA, the NIH, the HHS, and the USDA that has caused the epidemic. Callie had been working on and off for my campaign, advising me on those subjects since the beginning. And those subjects have been my primary focus for the last 20 years. I was delighted when Callie told me that day that he had also been advising President Trump. He told me President Trump was anxious to talk to me about chronic disease and other subjects, and to explore avenues of cooperation. He asked if I would take a call from the president. President Trump telephoned me a few minutes later, and I met with him the following day. A few weeks later, I met again with President Trump and his family members and closest advisors in Florida. In a series of long, intense discussions, I was surprised to discover that we are aligned on many key issues. In those meetings, he suggested that we join forces as a unity party. We talked about Abraham Lincoln's team of rivals. That arrangement would allow us to disagree publicly and privately, and fiercely, if need be, on issues over which we differ, while working together on the existential issues upon which we are in concordance. I was a ferocious critic of many of the policies during his first administration, and there are still issues and approaches upon which we continue to have very serious differences. But we are aligned with each other on other key issues, like ending the forever wars, ending the childhood disease epidemics, securing the border, protecting freedom of speech, unraveling the corporate capture of our regulatory agencies, getting the U.S. intelligence agencies out of the business of propagandizing and censoring and surveilling Americans and interfering with our elections. Following my first discussion with President Trump, I tried unsuccessfully to open similar discussions with Vice President Harris. Vice President Harris declined to meet or even to speak with me.
See, this is where some people talk about how conspiracy-laden that RFK Jr. is when he's talking about intelligence agencies and what have you, and also especially when it comes to the vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this man has an entire history, and I don't agree with a lot of his views and his conclusions about environmentalism. However, this guy, he does give a lot of credence to his opinions about the environment, because there's one thing you could talk about how, oh, he's a conspiracy nut. I think these people are listening to the sound bites that the mainstream narrative tells about RFK Jr. There is not much that this guy talks about that he hasn't researched very deeply and very scientifically. It's not like he goes off about these vaccines on some gut instinct or you just fly by night, you know what, conspiratorial things. He looks into these things in a scientific level. He talks to people who are involved in medicine. He talks to people who are involved in the government. He has a lot, because of who he is, because he's a Kennedy, he still has a lot of very good and deep and well-informed contacts that are experts in a lot of these subjects.
Sure.
So he doesn't just go off half-cocked on some cockamamie instinct or feeling about something. He is very, very grounded, and I challenge anybody who just thinks that this guy is some conspiracy nut to actually go back in a lot of interviews and listen to interviews with this man, who, and there have been some of the interviewers who have challenged him on some of his, especially vaccine theories and his points that he talks about and the hazards of the vaccines that go on. I've always thought that all these anti-vaxxers, and by the way, for the record, if you are against the COVID vaccine, that does not make you an anti-vaxxer. I would dare I would say the vast majority of people who are anti-COVID vaccine are full supporters of the standard vaccines that you give, or at least most of the vaccines that you give young children. Okay, so they're not anti-vaxxers. Again, what I've mentioned before about the fantastic manipulation of language that the left does to demonize their opponents. But anyway, he is not. He may be an anti-vaxxer, but he gives a lot of credence. I've never been in the anti-vaxxer camp. I have always believed that most of these people are a bunch of conspiracy nuts. I've never been one to lend myself to conspiracies. I think a lot of conspiracies are born from the idea that people do not want to acknowledge that a few people can do such colossal damage and change the course of history. And that's the very, very uncomfortable idea that a nobody can alter the course of history, of a nobody, a nothing, such as assassins or would-be assassins.
Yeah, sure.
And so therefore they have to come up with all these conspiracy theories in order to explain it, because it is frightening to think that your next door neighbor, who nobody knows, who keeps to himself, could literally alter the course of history.
Right.
And because the power to do destruction is so much greater than the power to build or to create something. So he is very, very grounded in scientific research, and that's why I will give anything he says when it comes to medicine, when it comes to science, health, nutrition, all these things. I will give him a lot of leeway, and I'll give him a lot of clout. And I do. Again, I don't agree with all of his things, but all of his ideas. about vaccines and environment, but there's a lot to be known and there's a lot to look into of what he says about them.
Suspending my candidacy is a heart-rending decision for me, but I'm convinced that it's the best hope for ending the Ukraine war and ending the chronic disease epidemic that is eroding our nation's vitality from the inside, and for finally protecting free speech. I feel a moral obligation to use this opportunity to save millions of American children above all things. In case some of you don't realize how dire the condition is of our children's health and chronic disease in general, I would urge you to view Dr. Carlson's recent interview with Callie Means and his sister, Dr. Casey Means, who is the top graduate of her class at Stanford Medical School. This is an issue that affects all of us far more directly and urgently than any culture war issue and all the other issues that we obsess on and that are tearing apart our country. This is the most important issue. Therefore, it has the potential to bring us together. So let me share a little bit about why I believe it's so urgent. Today, 2/3, we spend more on healthcare than any country on earth, twice what they pay in Europe. And yet we have the worst health outcomes of any nation in the world. We're about 79th in health outcomes behind Costa Rica and Nicaragua and Mongolia and other countries. Nobody has a chronic disease burden like we have. And during the COVID epidemic, we had the highest body count of any country in the world. We had 16% of the COVID deaths, and we only have 4.2% of the world's population. And CDC says that's because we are the sickest people on earth. We have the highest chronic disease rate on earth. And the average American who died from COVID had 3.8 chronic diseases. So these were people who had immune system collapse, who had mitochondrial dysfunction. And no other country has anything like this. 2/3 of American adults and children suffer from chronic health issues. 50 years ago, that number was less than 1%. So we've gone from 1% to 66%. In America, 74% of Americans are now overweight or obese, and 50% of our children. 120 years ago, when somebody was obese, they were sent to the circus. There were case reports done about them. Obesity was.
But you were going to say something? Oh.
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, those are startling statistics, and you know the amount of chronic diseases that we have in this country. I think as Americans we don't realize it. We're surrounded by it.
Yeah.
That we don't realize that in other countries the people there are just naturally, not naturally, but they're just more healthier per capita than we are. We see obese people all the time by these other countries. That would be a foreign concept, and
Yeah, I think so many of these things stem from this issue of putting so much trust into all these institutions instead of learning about things yourself, like the food pyramid.
Oh, yeah.
Right, the entire food pyramid should be flipped upside down, and then you do some research into the food pyramid and who created it. Oh, big agriculture,
right?
And specifically the grains. Kellogg.
Sure.
Kellogg, the guy who founded Kellogg's, the brand Kellogg's, was all big agriculture,
right,
of grains, and making cereal.
Yeah.
Oh,
when you asked that, I was like, I think it's a cereal company.
So exactly. Right. Yeah. But the guy I forget his first name, but Kellogg was one of the guys that the government asked to create the food pyramid. Mm-hmm. Oh, gee, what a coincidence! Grains is the most thing, is the biggest category of food that you should eat.
Exactly.
And it is devastating. The entire food pyramid should be flipped upside down. Your proteins and meats and all that should be the biggest a part of your diet, and grains should be, one of the smallest.
Yeah.
And he goes into this stuff.
I think they have changed that, though. I think I don't think the food pyramid that we grew up with is
I have
longer
heard that. I
canon.
haven't looked into
Yeah.
what the new
Yeah, I think they did change it.
modifications are, but it's still not great. That
Right,
much I do
right.
know. If they have modified it, but yeah, he goes into a deep dive here, and this is great. This is very important. This is
Sure.
something that I grew up with nutrition. My parents used to own a health food store, and then my father, had a vitamin company, manufactured vitamins. So this is very near and dear, and I have a lot of knowledge about this whole subject, and he's dead on.
Almost unknown. In Japan, the childhood obesity rate is 3%, compared to 50% here. Half of Americans have prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. When my uncle was president, I was a boy. Juvenile diabetes was effectively non-existent. A typical pediatrician would see one case of diabetes during his entire career, a 40 or 50-year career. Today, 1 out of every 3 kids who walks through his office door is diabetic or pre-diabetic, and the mitochondrial disorder that caused diabetes also causing Alzheimer's, which is now classified as diabetes, and it's costing this country more than our military budget every year. There's been an
That's
explosion of
wild.
neurological illnesses that I never saw as a kid: ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, Tourette's syndrome, narcolepsy, ASD, Asperger's, autism. In the year 2000, the autism rate was 1 in 1,500. Now, autism rates in kids are 1 in 36, according to CDC nationally. Nobody's talking about this. 1 in every 22 kids in California has autism. And this is a crisis that 77% of our kids are too disabled to serve in the United States military. What is happening to our country? And why isn't this in the headlines every single day? There's nobody else in the world that is experiencing this. This is only happening in America. About 18%, and by the way, there has been no change in diagnosis, which the industry sometimes like to say. There has been no change in screening. This is a change in incidence. In my generation,
I have to look into that, because it's to my understanding that a lot of these things, maybe not child obesity or what do they call it, childhood diabetes.
Diabetes, yeah.
Maybe that hasn't, but there are a lot of other things, especially mental and emotional, psychological diagnoses.
Mm-hmm.
There have actually been a lot of changes.
Oh, sure. I mean, I can't see in the 50s and 60s that they were doing these tests on kids and analysis that they would do today. I mean, it was like, they didn't have, autism wasn't
Wasn't even a thing
a
back
well-known
then.
word. Yeah,
Yeah.
It wasn't part of the colloquial
lexicon,
language.
yeah.
So there must be. I mean, doctors now are, saying a lot of like you said, a lot of kids are diagnosed as autistic, but
Well, the other thing is, well, I don't know, and I don't think he's just even talking about from the 1950s or 60s. I even think for the last 20 years or 30 years, there's been this huge change, and I think there have been steps of diagnosis. I would love to find out how he comes to that conclusion that there's been no change in diagnosis. I have a close family member who's a psychologist, and I love to talk to him. I enjoy talking to him and asking him about things in the psychological world. And I remember a conversation we had about 15 years ago, and he told me, he was a school psychologist at first until he got into his own private practice. But he told me that one of the most disturbing things that he saw was, number one, a change in diagnosis when it came to autism. And the other thing he said that was really disturbing was the relief he saw in parents' faces when their child was positively diagnosed with autism. And when I looked at him and said, "Wait, relief?" He says, "Oh yeah, Frank, relief, because now that they're diagnosed with autism, it's not their fault. they
Yeah.
didn't do anything wrong as a parent.
Sure.
And then I asked him, I said, how many cases of autism do you think are misdiagnosed? He said, oh, Frank, I would say it's about half.
Yeah.
That's scary. So you can't tell me that, okay, let's say he's wrong by half. Okay, a quarter of the diagnoses are misdiagnosed of autism. You can't tell me that that doesn't signify from 20 years ago or 30 years ago of autism to now. You can't tell me there hasn't been a change in diagnosis.
Right.
By doing that. So that's one thing that really jumped out at me on this speech when I first listened to it. I was like, I don't know about that. And I'd like to know why he says that. I mean, maybe he's got better information than I do.
Right. But yeah, my gut reaction is that would be incorrect.
I just that's a tough one to swallow. But okay, we'll continue.
70-year-old men, the autism rates are about 1 in 10,000. In my kids' generation, 1 in 34. I'll repeat, in California, 1 in 22. Why are we letting this happen? Why are we allowing this to happen to our children? These are the most precious assets that we have in this country. How can we let this happen to them? About 18% of American teens now have fatty liver disease. That's like 1 out of every 5. That disease, when I was a kid, only affected late-stage alcoholics who were elderly. Cancer rates are skyrocketing in the young and the old. Young adult cancers are up 79%. 1 in 4 American women is on antidepressant medication. 40% of teens have a mental health diagnosis. And 15% of high schoolers are on Adderall, and 500,000 children on SSRIs. So what's causing this suffering? I'll name 2 culprits. First, and the worst, is ultra-processed food. About 70% of American children's diet is ultra-processed. That means industrial manufactured in a factory. These foods consist primarily of processed sugar, ultra-processed grains, and seed oils. Laboratory scientists many of them formerly worked for the cigarette industry, which purchased all the big food companies in the 1970s and 80s, deployed thousands of scientists to figure out new chemicals to make the food more addictive. And these ingredients didn't exist 100 years ago. Humans aren't biologically adapted to eat them. Hundreds of these chemicals are now banned in Europe, but ubiquitous in American processed foods. The second culprit is toxic chemicals in our food, our medicine, and our environment. Pesticides, food additives, pharmaceutical drugs, and toxic waste permeate every cell of our bodies. The assault on our children's cells and hormones is unrelenting. To name just one problem, many of these chemicals increase estrogen because young children are ingesting so many of these hormone disruptors. America's puberty rate is now occurring at age 10 to 13, which is 6 years earlier than girls were reaching puberty in 1900. Our country has the earliest puberty rates of any continent on the earth. And no, this isn't because of better nutrition. This is not normal. Breast cancer is also estrogen driven, and it now strikes 1 in 8 women. We are mass poisoning all of our children and our adults. Considering the grievous human cost of this tragic epidemic of chronic disease, it seems almost crass to mention the damage it does to our economy. But I'll say, it is crippling the nation's finances. When my uncle was president, our country spent $0 on chronic disease. Today, government health care spending is almost all for chronic disease. And it's double the military budget. And it is the fastest growing budget item in the federal budget. And chronic disease costs more to the economy as a whole, costs at least $4 trillion, 5 times our military budget. And that's a 20% drag on everything we do and everything we aspire to. Poor and minority communities suffer disproportionately. People who worry about DEI or about bigotry of any kind, this dwarfs anything. We are poisoning the poor. We are systematically poisoning minorities across this country. Industry lobbyists have made sure that most of the food stamp lunch program, about 70% of food stamps and about 70 or 77% of school lunches are processed foods. There's no vegetables. There's nothing that you would want to eat. We are just poisoning the poor citizens, and that's why they have the highest chronic disease burden of anybody, any demographic in our country, and the highest in the world.
I don't do often. Most of my work is in hospitals and big corporate centers who have huge cafeterias, but I work on commercial kitchen equipment. And there are a number of schools, public schools, that we have accounts in. And almost every single public school has ancient, and I mean old, sometimes 35, 40, 50-year-old pieces of kitchen equipment. Now you say, okay, this is public education. They don't have any budget. They're certainly not putting that budget into their kitchen. Sure. Fair enough. But another reason why this is so old is because it's never used. I have been working in these kitchens when they're serving lunch, and there is nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, that's quote-unquote made in the kitchen. It comes out of the walk-in freezers. It gets put into ovens to heat up, or warmers to heat up, and sometimes microwaves to heat up. And like he said, there is never I've never seen vegetables. I've never seen any quote-unquote whole foods. Right, things that anybody could make in their kitchen very easily. It is all this ultra-processed stuff that comes out of these boxes that is in mass, and it's all made, it's all pre-made, it's frozen, and then it just gets warmed up, and it goes right on the tray line to these kids.
That's true. I don't remember, thinking back to my high school cafeteria, I don't remember there being a lot of healthy things. It was like, here's a chicken patty, here's a slice of pizza. Yeah. Just fill you up with garbage. You know, good luck staying awake second half of school,
And even that food was garbage. I remember pizza day used to be an exciting day. Sure. And our pizza in our school, I don't know what it was like you, but in Union, New Jersey, our pizza were English muffins with tomato sauce and one square of cheese that was warmed up so it would be slightly melted. I'm not kidding you. It was it was a round English muffin with tomato sauce on it with that cheese. And
ours were a little better than that. It wasn't that bad, but
I grew up in the hood, yo.
Yeah, I know.
So, all right, here we go. But what he's talking about is dead on.
The same food industry lobbied to make sure that nearly all agricultural subsidies go to commodity crops that are the feedstock of processed food industry. These policies are destroying small farms, and they're destroying our soils. We give about, I think, 8 times as much in subsidies to tobacco than we do to fruits and vegetables. It makes no sense. If we want a healthy country, the good news is that we can change all this. We can change it very, very quickly. America can get healthy again. To do that, we need to do 3 things. First, we need to root out the corruption in our health agencies. Second, we need to change incentives in our healthcare system. And third, we need to inspire Americans to get healthy again. 80% of NIH grants go to people who have conflicts of interest. These are the people, virtually everybody who sits, Joe Biden just appointed a new panel to NIH to decide the food recommendations. And they're all people who are from the industry. They're all people who are from the processed food companies. They're deciding what Americans, hear is healthy. and the recommendations on the food pyramid, and and what goes to our school lunch programs, what go to the program, the Swiss program, the food stamp programs. They are all corrupted and conflicted individuals. These agencies, the FDA, USDA, and CDC, all of them are controlled by giant for-profit corporations. 75% of the FDA's funding doesn't come from taxpayer, it comes from pharma. And pharma executives and consultants and lobbyists cycle in and out of these agencies with President Trump's backing. I'm going to change that. We're going to staff these agencies with honest scientists and doctors who are free from industry funding. We're going to make sure the decisions of consumers, doctors, and patients are informed by unbiased science. A sick child is the best thing for the pharmaceutical industry. When American children or adults get sick with a chronic condition, they're put on medication for their entire life. Imagine what will happen when Medicare starts paying for Ozempic, which costs $1,500 a month, and it's being recommended for children as young as 6.
Got to start
all
them
for
young.
Condition obesity that is completely preventable and barely even existed 100 years ago. And 74% of Americans are obese. The cost, if all of them took their Ozempic prescription, is $3 trillion a year. This is a drug that is made by Novo Nordisk, the biggest company in Europe. It's a Danish company, and the Danish government does not recommend it. It recommends change in diet to treat obesity and exercise. And in our country, the recommendation now is for Ozempic to children at age 6. Novo Nordisk, the biggest company in
Whoever thought one of the biggest threats to RFK Jr. was going to be the Danish government? Sorry, I had to say that.
That's a conspiracy theory. I mean, that's a crazy conspiracy. Who killed RFK Jr.?
Yeah,
The
Danes.
Danish.
Yeah. He talked about that pharmaceutical company.
No one's talked about the Danes since Hamlet.
Yeah.
Europe, and virtually its entire value is based upon its projections of what it's going to sell, of the Ozempic it's going to sell to America. And we have the food lobbyists have a bill in front of Congress today that is backed by the White House, backed by Vice President Harris and President Biden to allow this to happen. This $3 trillion cost that is going to bankrupt our country. For a fraction of that amount, we could buy organic food for every American family, 3 meals a day, and eliminate diabetes altogether. We're going to bring healthy food back to school lunches. We're going to stop subsidizing the worst foods with our agricultural subsidies. We're going to get toxic chemicals out of our food. We're going to reform the entire food system. And for that, we need new leadership in Washington. Because unfortunately, both the Democrats and the Republican parties are in cahoots with the big food producers, Big Pharma and Big Ag, which are among the DNC's major donors. Vice President Harris has expressed no interest in addressing this issue. 4 more years of Democratic rule will complete the consolidation of corporate and neocon power, and our children will be the ones who suffer most. I got involved with chronic disease 20 years ago, not because I chose to or wanted to. It was essentially thrust upon me. It was an issue that should have been central to the environmental movement. I was a central leader at that time, but it was widely ignored by all the institutions, including the NGOs, who should have been protecting our kids against toxins. It was an orphaned issue, and I had a weakness for orphans. I watched generations of children get sicker and sicker. I had 11 siblings, and I had 7 kids myself. I was conscious of what was happening in their classrooms and to their friends, and I watched these sick kids, these damaged kids. In that generation, almost all of them are damaged. And nobody in power seemed to care or to even notice. For 19 years, I prayed every morning that God would put me in a position to end this calamity. The chronic disease crisis was one of the primary reasons for my running for president. along with ending censorship in the Ukraine war. It's the reason I've made the heart-wrenching decision to suspend my campaign and to support President Trump. This decision is agonizing for me because of the difficulties it causes my wife and my children and my friends. But I have the certainty that this is what I've meant to do. And that certainty gives me internal peace, even in storms. If I'm given the chance to fix the chronic disease crisis and reform our food production, I promise that within 2 years, we will watch chronic disease burden lift dramatically. We will make Americans healthy again. Within 4 years, America will be a healthy country. We will be stronger, more resilient, more optimistic, and happier.
I don't know, 4 years seems to be a very, very short and small window to tackle, even according to him, the most important issue in this country.
Yeah, even if he became, a czar and was able to dictate what everyone ate every day, that would be
exactly. If he became supreme ruler, dictator of America, I can't imagine he's going to reverse all of that in 4 years. That was almost like a Trumpian kind of claim. It's just hyperbole, but anyway, just.
I won't fail in doing this. Ultimately, the future, however it happens, is in God's hands and in the hands of the American voters and those of President Trump. If President Trump is elected and honors his word, the vast burden of chronic disease that now demoralizes and bankrupts the country will disappear. This is a spiritual journey for me. I reached my decision through deep prayer, through hard-nosed logic, and I asked myself, what choices must I make to maximize my chances to save America's children and restore national health? I felt that if I refused this opportunity, I would not be able to look myself in the mirror, knowing that I could have saved lives of countless children and reversed this country's chronic disease epidemic. I'm 70 years old. I may have a decade to be effective. I can't imagine that President Harris would allow me or anyone to solve these dire problems. After 8 years of President Harris, any opportunity for me to fix the problem will be out of my reach forever. President Trump has told me that he wants this to be his legacy. I'm choosing to believe that this time he will follow through. His son, his biggest donors, his closest friends, and all support this objective. My joining the Trump campaign will be a difficult sacrifice for my wife and children, but worthwhile if there's even a small chance of saving these kids. Ultimately, the only thing that will save our country and our children is if we choose to love our kids more than we hate each other. That's why I launched my campaign to unify America. My dad and uncle made such an enduring mark on the character of our nation, not so much because of any particular policies that they promoted, but because they were able to inspire profound love for our country and to fortify our sense of ourselves as a national community held together by ideals. They were able to put their love into the intentions and hearts of ordinary Americans and to unify a national populist movement of Americans, blacks and whites, Hispanics, urban and rural Americans. They inspired affection and love and high hopes and a culture of kindness that continue to radiate among Americans from their memory. That's the spirit on which I ran my campaign and that I intend to bring into the campaign of President Trump. Instead of vitriol and polarization, I will appeal to the values that unite us, the goals that we could achieve if only we weren't at each other's throats. The most unifying theme for all Americans is that we all love our children. If we all unite around that issue now, we can finally give them the protection, the health, and the future that they deserve. Thank you all very much.
Well, there it is. That was the speech. I think it was a great speech. I think it was a vitally important speech for every American to listen to and hear, even if you don't agree with everything. I don't agree with everything he said there.
Of course. But yeah, I mean, that's one of the best speeches I've heard in 20 years probably. I mean, he calls out the establishment. He calls out the party that he grew up in, the Democratic Party, and he also pivots and talks about the brighter future that we could have by improving our health. It's not. I'd always heard that he was a big proponent of health and the whole country and things like that. But I had never understood those statistics in the way that he, when you hear those numbers, you go, wow, that's really is the most important thing. Like, how can we do anything else in this country if we're so this unhealthy, overall?
And even if not all those statistics are completely accurate, or there's some other factors which would reduce the severity of the statistics. Number one, he's on the right track. Number two, everybody talks about on both sides of the political fence, they want somebody who's real and genuine and honest.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't think you get more genuine and honest and real than RFK Jr. I don't agree with everything, but he even got choked up there for a little bit, about 30-something minutes or 35 minutes into the speech. And, I mean, you could tell the guy he's the genuine article. And, again, I believe that he is a truth seeker, and he does everything, with all the... with the interest in mind of facts and truth. And that's exactly why I'm doing this podcast.
Sure.
That's the entire purpose of this, is to find out what's facts and truth. I think he is very genuine. I don't think he's got everything right. No one does. But I tell you, he's quite compelling, and I think he's the genuine article. So if you want an honest politician, you've got one right here.
Right. I mean, but overall, I mean, this has been such a crazy election cycle so far. I mean, between Biden dropping out and then Harris being installed and Trump getting shot, and who would have thought that a year ago would you have thought that RFK would be giving an almost hour-long speech saying that he's going to join forces with Donald Trump? I mean,
no,
it's a crazy thought, but here we are.
And that Donald Trump would welcome him in and embrace him.
Right.
I didn't see that one coming.
But now it seems like a somewhat natural fit, given what we've seen over the past year.
Yeah, and I know there was even some talk and rumors that Trump was going to ask him to be his VP pick. So I don't know if that was ever a strong consideration, but
right.
But there was a lot of talk about that and how a powerful ticket that would create.
Sure. Yeah.
But even him being on the administration or the cabinet of Trump is, I think, a very strong move.
Right. And it further shows unity between, as we've been saying, between liberals and the MAGA movement. It shows that there's a lot in common, that the Democratic Party has moved so far to the left that we see these two people who have big policy differences, but they're later Friday, Trump invited him on stage and he gave a speech.
I was just going to bring that up.
You're like, wow, we're like,
and you saw the support of the crowd.
Yeah,
of
sure.
RFK Jr. I mean,
Right,
they just completely embrace the man wholly and completely and totally.
He's a Kennedy.
Yeah. A MAGA crowd,
Yeah.
So supposedly filled with such hatred and vitriol, and embrace this Kennedy very warmly and very enthusiastically.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I was going to do one thing, just to go back to our discussion about censorship earlier on. I did notice in the CNN feed the part where he starts talking about, early in the speech, talks about how Biden dropped out and they installed Harris as the candidate. There's a point where the CNN anchor breaks in and talks over him at that point. And he says, well, they installed Harris and no one voted for her. And then the CNN anchor goes, you're listening live to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as he suspends his campaign. Oh, it's been a crazy year. It's like, no, that's the most important part. They literally are talking over the important part. And that goes back to the concept of that censorship doesn't have to be it's not sometimes
a complete
it's not
cut
as
off
overt.
and silencing.
It's things like that where the CNN crowd didn't get that important information there.
Yeah. I actually, somebody told me, and I didn't look into this and I didn't find out, but another one of my friends, he said that CNN and MSNBC cut this speech short. Now, I don't know if that's true. Maybe that's what he was referring to, of just cutting them short. I don't know.
I did hear that. And
you heard,
then,
I don't know if it's
but
true.
I also
or not.
heard Fox News did it too. So maybe, maybe they all just.
I mean, listen, it is TV, and time is prime.
Right. I mean, there's certain restrictions that they have or whatever, so you can't. But blatantly talking over him at the important part seems to be a little different.
Yeah, and they don't do anything because time is such a commodity on TV.
Yeah.
They don't do anything by accident when it comes to time and timing. Sure. Everything is planned out so meticulously and exactly. Mm-hmm. So, that's why also I haven't watched TV news in maybe 5 years. I mean, I might have turned it on once or twice in 5 years just to get a gist of something that happened that was visual, and they have somebody on camera, just to get an idea of exactly what happened and when and where.
Right.
But other than that, I have never sat down to watch even a half an hour of TV news, probably in the last 5-6 years, maybe longer.
Yeah,
it's maybe closer to 7 years now.
Right.
It's it's just a horrible format. It's horrendous.
I mean, but life has so much changed over the past 20 years. Nobody sits down and watches. Say, oh, it's 6:30. I got to sit down and watch. What's the news today? We already know what the news is. We hear it all day. We get notifications all day.
Yeah, unless you're 70 years old now.
Right.
Those are the only ones in the 60s or 70s and older. Those are the only ones who are still watching this network movie.
Sure.
I mean, there's a few others. I did hear a frightening thing in one of the hospital kitchens, and I heard this woman say, like, I watch ABC, and if it's not on there, I don't believe it. And I was like, wow, that's frightening.
Yeah,
and she was probably in her 40s.
Really?
Yeah. Maybe
50s. Thing to hear nowadays. It's not the days of Walter Cronkite.
It literally made me put my wrench down and go, huh? Did I just hear that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So she was obviously talking to somebody else, but I was just stunned.
Wow.
So, all right. Well, I think that wraps this episode up. This is our longest, and for any of you who are still listening to this or listen to it to the end, I thank you profusely. This is by far almost double the time of our longest podcast previously to this. Not that we've have a lot. This is only episode 4, but I thank you for listening, and I'm going to try to do something similar, but it won't be the entire speech of Kamala Harris. So we'll see if I can get that done in a timely fashion. Otherwise, thank you for listening. Like and subscribe. Send it to everybody you know. Thank you, and until next time, take care.